I died as Marcus's wife, and it was not a quiet death. It was the slow unraveling of a woman who gave everything and received nothing in return. I had been raised to be the perfect bride, taught to smile through pain, to make others comfortable even when I was bleeding inside. When Marcus chose me, society envied me. They saw his sharp features, his rising fortune, his confident stride, and believed I had secured a golden future. But they did not see the way his eyes flickered whenever Lila walked into the room, the way his mother Clara dismissed me with thinly veiled disdain, or the way his sister Vivian whispered to her friends that I was little more than an ornament. They did not see how he used my dowry to build his empire, or how he took credit for the connections my family had nurtured for decades. I endured it all, convincing myself that love was sacrifice, that loyalty would one day be rewarded. I smiled at the dinners where he paraded me as his hostess while slipping away to Lila's side. I poured wine for guests who made cruel jokes about mistresses in front of me. I let Clara cut me down with her words, let Vivian laugh at me, let society mock me, all because I believed Marcus would one day realize I was worth more than convenience. That day never came. Instead, he humiliated me in the most public way possible. He divorced me for Lila, standing tall as he signed the papers, his lips curled into a smile while mine trembled. The mistress who had mocked me for years stepped into my place as if she had won some grand prize, and the world cheered her victory while spitting on my name. I became a shadow, exiled from the circle I had once commanded, abandoned by those who had claimed to be my friends. Whispers followed me like daggers. She was never enough. She was just a fool. She deserved it. I wasted away in silence, stripped of dignity, stripped of purpose, stripped of everything except regret. Not regret for losing Marcus, no, I regretted every second I had wasted trying to win him. And when death came for me, I did not resist. I let it take me, thinking my story was over. But it was not. When I opened my eyes, the weight of silk pressed against my body. The veil brushed my cheeks, the scent of roses filled the air, and music swelled as doors opened before me. I froze, my pulse thundering, because I knew this moment. I had lived it before. I was standing at the altar once again, a bride about to marry Marcus, a bride about to step into a life of humiliation and betrayal. Only this time I was not trembling. I was not blind. I was not his fool. I remembered everything, and knowledge was power. I looked at Marcus standing at the altar, his confident smile polished for the guests, his eyes glinting with triumph. He thought he had won me again, that he would use me as his foundation, that I was the same obedient wife ready to be broken. But this time I was not walking toward ruin. I was walking toward revenge. I let the ceremony unfold as it had once before, my lips moving through vows that had once been chains. For better or worse. My mind twisted the words into a promise that his worst was coming. In sickness and in health. He would taste the sickness of regret long before he felt any comfort. Until death do us part. Yes, until his pride, his power, his empire died. The ring slid onto my finger, but I did not feel bound. I felt sharpened. The kiss sealed the performance, and the applause thundered around us, but inside I was already planning my first moves. At the reception I moved like a queen in disguise, smiling at guests, laughing at jokes, speaking softly with the elegance expected of me, but behind every word I calculated. I remembered the names of allies who had betrayed me before, the merchants who had abandoned me, the women who had laughed at my downfall. I saw them again, but this time I knew exactly how to turn them. Sympathy could be a weapon sharper than steel, and I would wield it to carve out my throne. I sat beside Marcus as he boasted of his future, his voice dripping with arrogance, and I placed my hand over his as if I adored him. The guests saw devotion. What they did not see was the silent fire in my chest, the vow I whispered to myself that Marcus would regret ever thinking of me his pawn. That night, as the music faded and the guests departed, I stared at the gilded cage that had once become my prison. I traced the veil with my fingers, remembering the years of humiliation I had endured within these walls, and I smiled, not with joy, but with cold resolve. This time I would not be the wife who was cast aside. I would be the wife who rose above it all, the wife he would spend the rest of his life regretting, the woman he would never win back. The morning after the wedding was when the act began. I opened my eyes to the familiar room, the heavy drapes pulled closed, the scent of wine lingering from the night before, and Marcus lying beside me with the smug contentment of a man who believed he had conquered me. In my first life I had turned toward him with timid hope, believing myself blessed, but now I forced my expression into softness only because he expected it. He reached for me, his lips curving into the same polished smile that once disarmed me, and I let him kiss my hand as if I were still blind to the future. He rose quickly, speaking of meetings and business, of the empire he intended to build on my dowry, and I murmured my agreement with the same gentle tone that had once been genuine. He left thinking I adored him. He left thinking I would never stand in his way. He left not knowing I was already planning the cracks in his foundation. When Clara entered soon after, her eyes raked over me with the disdain I remembered all too well. Her words were wrapped in civility but laced with poison, reminders of duties, warnings about appearances, insults hidden beneath the guise of advice. In my first life I had wilted beneath her scorn, desperate to win her approval, but this time I lowered my lashes and let her think her barbs had struck. Approval was meaningless. Her underestimation was the shield I needed. Vivian followed later, giggling with a friend as she whispered cruel things just loud enough for me to hear. I smiled and said nothing, committing every word to memory. Both of them thought I was harmless. They were wrong. At breakfast Marcus dominated the conversation, boasting of the deals he would secure, casually dismissing the concerns of his partners. He spoke of my inheritance as if it were already his to burn, and when he turned to me for agreement I nodded as though in awe of his brilliance. He never noticed how closely I listened, how I memorized every name, every number, every reckless promise. These were the very men who would one day abandon him, and this time I would help them do it sooner. The servants moved around me quietly, and I studied them as much as I studied the family. In my first life many of them had betrayed me for coin, carrying tales to Clara or Vivian, spreading whispers of my supposed arrogance. I remembered which ones had faltered and which ones had broken. Now I offered small kindnesses, soft words, small tokens of gratitude. A maid with trembling hands received a bracelet I pretended I no longer wanted. A guard on night duty found his purse mysteriously heavier. With every gesture I bound them to me, turning their loyalty without ever demanding it outright. They would be my unseen eyes and ears, the messengers who gave me what Marcus believed hidden. And then there was Lila. I knew where he went when he claimed to be buried in work. I remembered the exact shade of her smirk, the tone of her voice when she mocked me for being too fragile to keep his attention. In my first life I had discovered her too late, broken by the betrayal, desperate for answers. This time I would not storm into her arms begging for truth. This time I would reach her first, plant seeds of doubt where she thought herself secure, twist her pride into anger, and turn her into a blade aimed at Marcus's throat. For now, I let him slip away each evening with excuses on his lips and perfume clinging to his clothes when he returned. I lay beside him in silence, breathing evenly, feigning devotion, while in my mind I sharpened the moment I would let her strike. By the end of that first day, nothing outwardly had changed. I was still Marcus's wife, still Clara's target, still Vivian's joke, still the woman society believed was blessed by fortune. But inside, everything was different. I was no longer the timid bride hoping for love. I was the woman who had already lived her humiliation, already dyed her disgrace, already buried her tears. And now, with every smile I gave and every nod I feigned, I was building the throne I would one day sit upon. Marcus thought he had secured me. In truth, he had only chained himself to the woman who would destroy him. Days blurred into weeks and the performance never slipped. I played the dutiful wife with flawless precision, standing beside Marcus as he boasted of victories that weren't his, smiling at the family who sneered behind their glasses of wine, greeting guests who whispered about Lila in corners. In my first life I had flinched under every glance, every insult, but now I met them all with calm, my silence sharper than any retort. They thought me blind, they thought me weak, and that belief became my weapon. At every dinner and luncheon I let Marcus shine while I stood in his shadow, the adoring wife, yet each time I spoke I laced my words with subtle poison. At one gathering when he boasted of his business genius I lifted my glass and praised his courage for investing even when others would have considered it too great a risk. Laughter rippled politely, but I saw the flicker of unease in the faces of his partners. They were men who measured everything in risk, and my soft words had shifted their admiration into doubt. Marcus kissed my hand as if I had supported him, not realizing I had just pulled a thread loose. I remembered who had betrayed me before, and I began to work on them one by one. The women who once laughed at my disgrace found themselves charmed by my warmth, my memory of their children's names, my compliments delivered at just the right moment. The merchants who had abandoned me in my first life found themselves courted with favors that Marcus never noticed. Slowly, carefully, I began weaving a net of influence that was mine alone. And then there was Adrian. He was different from the others. A widower with a calm strength, he watched me with eyes that seemed to see through my mask. In my first life I had ignored him, too consumed by Marcus to notice the man who always treated me with respect. This time I saw the way he studied the room, the way his voice carried quiet authority, the way his words to me were laced with respect instead of condescension. When I laughed at one of his subtle jokes, it was genuine, the first real laugh I had allowed myself in this second life. He smiled faintly, as though he knew I was playing a dangerous game, and though he never said it, I felt the weight of his unspoken support. He became an unexpected ally, and though his affection grew clear with every encounter, I tucked it away for later. My revenge came first. Marcus noticed none of this. He was too wrapped in his arrogance, too sure of his control. He believed society adored him, believed he could flaunt Lila without consequence, believed his family's scorn for me would never shift. He never saw how guests leaned closer to me during conversations, how whispers followed me now instead of him, how Clara's sharp words were beginning to sound petty compared to my graceful replies. Every time Marcus boasted, I ensured the right people heard a detail that made him sound reckless. Every time Lila slipped into a room, I guided conversations so her presence seemed cheap and desperate. Every time Clara sneered, I smiled so sweetly that guests later praised my composure. The tide was turning slowly, invisibly, but it was turning in my favor. At night, when Marcus returned from his supposed meetings, I lay beside him, my hand resting gently on his chest, my face the picture of devotion. He thought I was conquered, bound to him by vows and duty. But as he slept, I stared into the darkness with cold clarity. The vows had not bound me to him. They had bound him to me. And step by step, whisper by whisper, I was leading him toward the same ruin he had once forced upon me. The mask of loyalty became my most valuable weapon. Marcus strutted through society with me on his arm, convinced I was still the ornament he had polished, but he did not notice the way eyes lingered on me longer than him, or how laughter grew louder when I spoke instead of when he did. I crafted dinners that placed me at the center of conversation, charming the powerful with small gestures that Marcus dismissed as meaningless. He thought influence came from contracts and gold. I knew better. Influence lived in whispers, in the tilt of a glass, in the way women chose who to emulate and men chose who to trust. Slowly those choices shifted toward me. I began to build my own circle, small at first, just women overlooked by their husbands, men slighted by Marcus, servants who owed me quiet favors. I wrapped them in subtle kindnesses, gifts that seemed thoughtless but were carefully chosen, words that seemed casual but hit their insecurities with precision. It was not Marcus's empire I wanted to inherit. It was his stage. And I was stepping into the spotlight he never thought I could claim. Adrian became more than an observer. At one gathering he offered his arm when Marcus left me stranded to chase a conversation with a potential investor. The room noticed. He spoke to me with a softness Marcus never had, drawing laughter from me that was genuine, not rehearsed. When I excused myself he pressed a folded note into my hand with the name of a merchant Marcus had been cheating. The information was precise and devastating, and when I used it later in conversation with the right guest, Marcus's partner began to waver. Adrian's gaze followed me across the room, steady and knowing, and though I reminded myself that revenge was my purpose, I felt the pull of something warmer each time our paths crossed. I let him hover at the edge of my plans, both ally and temptation, but always secondary to the crown I was building. Meanwhile, Marcus grew bolder with Lila, emboldened by his belief that his status made him untouchable. He began to flaunt her at public events, subtle at first, then reckless. I remembered the agony this had caused me before, how I had begged him for answers, how I had drowned in shame while society mocked me. Now I welcomed it. I encouraged it even, letting him believe my silence was fear. Each time Lila appeared on his arm, I exaggerated my composure, smiled with such grace that others whispered of my strength and pitied me while condemning him. I fanned the flames by letting rumor slip. How Marcus promised me he would change, how I prayed for patience, how I endured humiliation with dignity. Every whisper made me shine brighter while Lila's brazenness began to rot her reputation. What had once destroyed me was now becoming the foundation of my throne. Clara and Vivian were the easiest to manipulate. Clara continued her scathing critiques, Vivian her careless gossip, and I responded with nothing but patience. Guests began to notice the cruelty, began to murmur that perhaps Marcus's family was unworthy of the wife they had been given. Clara's sharpest barbs began to bounce back as shame, Vivian's gossip began to sound desperate. They had not realized the game had shifted, that I was no longer defending myself but letting them expose themselves as shallow and bitter. Their disdain had once been daggers. Now it was entertainment for the court I was quietly building. At night Marcus grumbled about his business dealings, frustrated by partners who suddenly grew hesitant, furious at creditors who pressed harder. I listened in silence, offering gentle reassurances that sounded like devotion but were meant to remind him that I was still at his side. He believed it, too arrogant to imagine that his greatest enemy slept inches away. When he closed his eyes, I stayed awake, calculating which ally to secure next, which whisper to feed, which mask to wear tomorrow. He thought I was conquered. He thought he had won. He had no idea that the woman beside him was already preparing his fall. Marcus's arrogance was a gift I wielded against him every day. He flaunted Lila with growing boldness, convinced society still adored him enough to excuse it. In my first life her presence had gutted me, left me sobbing in silence while people laughed at my humiliation, but this time I played the role of the sainted wife who bore the betrayal with grace. I let the world see me smile politely as he brushed her hand in full view, let them marvel at my composure as whispers spread through every ballroom. And then, quietly, I twisted the knife. With a well-placed comment here, a tear held back there, I made sure the story became not about his charm but about my endurance. Lila thought she was winning, striding into gatherings with jewels he could not afford, whispering in my ear that she would take everything from me, but she did not notice the way society began to tire of her. They called her bold to her face and shameless behind her back. They compared her glitter to my grace, and she always lost. I fed this fire carefully. I hinted to a duchess that Marcus had promised me he would end the affair. I confided to a merchant's wife that I prayed for patience. I let the gossip spread that I endured for love while he betrayed me. Every word I spoke turned sympathy toward me and scorn toward them both. Lila became not the victor but the clown, Marcus not the charmer but the fool who paraded his mistress while his wife shone brighter by enduring. Clara fanned the flames without realizing it. She sneered more viciously, mocked me more cruelly, her words dripping like acid in rooms full of guests. Once those words had pierced me deeply, but now I let them roll off with a smile so practiced that even the cruelest insult made me look kinder by contrast. People began to murmur that Clara was jealous of me, that her cruelty revealed her own bitterness. Vivian's gossip was no better. Her careless whispers painted her as spiteful and small. Every barb they threw only polished my halo further. By remaining silent, by keeping my composure, I was crafting an image that Marcus himself could never tarnish. Society loves a tragedy, but they love a martyr more, and I had become their perfect vision of endurance. Behind the scenes I strengthened my net. The servants, once disloyal, now brought me scraps of information with eagerness, grateful for the small favors I provided. A letter misplaced became mine to read, a conversation overheard found its way to my ear. Through them I learned of Marcus's growing debts, of contracts delayed, of investors growing restless. He still boasted at gatherings, pretending wealth flowed endlessly, but I knew the truth. I knew which creditors pressed hardest, which merchants he had failed to pay, which investors were one disappointment away from abandoning him. And at just the right moments, I let fragments of that truth slip where they would do the most damage. A partner who had trusted him for years suddenly refused to extend another loan. A merchant who had always greeted him warmly began to hesitate. A nobleman who had backed his ventures pulled away without explanation. Marcus raged in private, furious at their betrayal, blind to the fact that their doubt was my design. Adrian became more prominent in these days. He never pushed, never demanded, but his quiet presence was impossible to ignore. At one dinner where Marcus abandoned me mid-conversation to chase a wealthy patron, Adrian stepped in, his arm steady, his voice low and reassuring. He guided me through the crowd, shielding me from pointed whispers, and in that moment I allowed myself the smallest sliver of gratitude. Later he handed me another piece of information, proof of Marcus's dealings with a questionable partner. I tucked it away, already knowing how and when I would use it. His eyes lingered on me with something more than alliance, something warmer, but I hardened myself. I could not afford distraction. Not yet. Revenge came before comfort. Marcus, blind in his arrogance, still believed he was untouchable. He saw the whispers but thought them harmless. He saw Lila's growing recklessness but believed it only made him more desirable. He saw Clara's cruelty and Vivian's mockery but thought it strengthened his position. He never realized the cracks beneath his feet were widening every day, never realized the ground was rotting because I was poisoning it with precision. Every smile I gave him, every gentle word, every touch of my hand as though I adored him was another chain he wrapped around his own neck. The night came when Lila, emboldened by Marcus's attention and enraged by society's whispers, finally confronted him in public. It was at a grand banquet, the kind of evening where the elite gathered to judge one another in whispers and glances. She arrived dripping with jewels, her voice raised as she accused him of betrayal, of promising her more than he gave, of using her as a toy. Gasps rippled through the room as she screamed his name, as she clawed at his arm, as she revealed in her fury every secret of their affair. In my first life I had crumbled in that moment, broken by the humiliation. This time I widened my eyes, let my lips tremble, let a single tear slide down my cheek as I whispered his name in disbelief. The crowd turned instantly, pitying me, condemning him. Adrian stepped forward, steady at my side, shielding me from the spectacle, his presence amplifying the image of me as the wronged wife who endured cruelty with grace. Marcus shouted, denied, tried to contain the chaos, but the damage was done. Lila stormed out in rage, society's whispers became condemnation, and the image Marcus had worked so hard to build collapsed in one night. When we returned home he slammed doors, cursed, accused me of betrayal, of weakness, of conspiring against him. I lowered my eyes, said nothing, let him rage while I stood calm. He did not realize that his fury only widened the cracks. He did not realize that he had just lost the one thing he valued most, his reputation. And he certainly did not realize that the wife he thought powerless had been the one to guide every step of his ruin. I lay in bed that night while he drank himself into a stupor, and I whispered to myself in the silence of the room. This is only the beginning. After the banquet disaster, Marcus's control over society began to unravel. Invitations that had once flooded our doorstep slowed to a trickle, and the ones that did arrive were addressed to both of us but designed to place me at the center. At luncheons the women gathered around me, asking how I endured with such grace, praising my composure, whispering their disgust at Marcus's arrogance. Men who had once clasped his hand with respect now turned their conversation toward me, eager for my approval, eager to curry favor with the woman whose presence elevated every gathering. I did not push myself forward, I let them bring me into their circles, let their whispers shape me into the queen of a stage Marcus no longer controlled. He saw it happening but could not stop it. His pride would not let him acknowledge that society was turning toward me. Instead he blamed his partners, his family, even Lila, never suspecting the woman at his side. Clara's behavior began to backfire spectacularly. The sharper her words, the more people pitied me. At one gathering she scolded me loudly for speaking too long with Adrian, calling it unbecoming of a wife. The room froze, and I lowered my lashes, murmuring an apology so soft it broke the silence. Gasps rippled, and when conversation resumed it was full of quiet condemnation, not for me, but for her. They whispered that Clara was cruel, that she treated me like a servant instead of a daughter-in-law. Vivian's gossip fared no better. She spread tales about me trying to seduce men behind Marcus's back, but Adrian himself publicly dismissed the rumor with a simple line that silenced the room: a woman of Elena's dignity would not stoop to such lies. The rumor died instantly, Vivian's credibility burned, and my image grew even stronger. The family that had once made me a laughingstock was now making themselves look petty and jealous. Marcus's temper flared more often behind closed doors. He shouted at me for being too quiet, for being too graceful, for stealing the attention he thought belonged to him. I endured it with calm eyes, never raising my voice, never trembling. The more he raged, the more obvious his weakness became. And every outburst only deepened society's sympathy for me. At one dinner, when he snapped at me for interrupting, the room chilled. I bowed my head as if chastised, but when I glanced up I caught eyes filled with pity and disdain directed at him. That night whispers spread through the city that Marcus was a brute while I was his patient, dignified wife. His reputation was crumbling faster than he could rebuild it, and he had no idea I was the one pulling it apart thread by thread. Adrian's presence grew harder to ignore. He stood beside me at every gathering, steady and unwavering, a subtle shield against Marcus's temper and society's cruelty. When Marcus left me abandoned at one event to chase a nobleman with promises of wealth, Adrian offered his arm, guiding me through the room with a dignity Marcus had never given me. Whispers followed us, not scandal but admiration. They called him a gentleman, called me fortunate to have such quiet support. Marcus noticed, of course. He snarled in private, accused me of embarrassing him, warned me never to encourage Adrian. I smiled sweetly, promised obedience, and continued to do nothing to stop the rumors from spreading. Adrian never pressed beyond what I allowed, but his eyes lingered on me with warmth I had never known. I reminded myself my throne came first, my revenge came first, but the thought of him was a flame I could not entirely smother. Meanwhile Marcus's business faltered. Partners who once trusted him pulled away, merchants demanded payment he did not have, investors hesitated. I made sure of it. Through servants and whispers I leaked fragments of truth, his debts, his reckless spending, his broken promises. He tried to cover the cracks with more arrogance, tried to laugh off the whispers, but even his allies began to avoid his company. When Clara confronted him in private, furious that the family's reputation was collapsing, he lashed out at her too, fracturing the last support he thought unshakable. Vivian fled to her friends, embarrassed by his failures. The family that once mocked me was splintering, turning inward, desperate to distance themselves from the ruin. At night Marcus tossed and turned, muttering about betrayal, about disloyal partners, about ungrateful allies. I lay beside him with my eyes closed, a serene smile hidden in the dark. He thought he was losing everything because others were weak, because fate was cruel, because the world conspired against him. He could not see the truth, that every thread unraveling, every whisper spreading, every ally abandoning him was because I had guided them there. And as I listened to his restless sleep, I promised myself this was only the beginning. His empire was trembling now, but soon it would fall completely. The cracks widened into fractures, and Marcus could no longer hide them. Creditors came to the estate in person, demanding payment he could not provide, their voices echoing down the marble halls for every servant to hear. Once, I would have hidden in shame, praying no one saw our humiliation, but this time I welcomed it. I ensured the doors remained open, ensured whispers traveled beyond our walls. By nightfall the entire city knew that Marcus, the man who once boasted of endless wealth, was cornered by debts. He stormed into his study, tearing through ledgers, blaming everyone but himself, while I stood at the threshold, silent and composed. He cursed his partners, accused his rivals, swore that I was a distraction. He never realized the calm woman in the doorway was the storm tearing his life apart. I moved faster, sharper, pressing the advantage before he could recover. With Adrian's quiet guidance, I secured allies who had once belonged to Marcus. Adrian introduced me to merchants who had grown weary of Marcus's arrogance, men who craved stability over ambition. They found it in me. I spoke with poise, promised them reliability, and soon they began shifting their support without even realizing they had abandoned him. At a gala where Marcus tried to boast of new investments, I stepped forward with documents, records of his unpaid debts, evidence of false contracts, proof of his desperation. I did not raise my voice, I did not accuse, I simply laid the truth on the table in a tone so calm it cut deeper than any scream. Silence fell, then whispers swelled, and by the end of the evening Marcus's reputation was ash. Lila, ever reckless, abandoned him in his moment of need. She had paraded herself as his triumph, but when the whispers turned, she fled to richer arms. Society laughed openly at her, calling her a fool who had bet on the wrong man. Marcus raged, begging her to stay, but she slipped away without looking back. His family fared no better. Clara and Vivian, desperate to preserve their own standing, distanced themselves from him. They whispered that they had always warned him, that he alone bore the blame. They once scorned me, but now they clung to me in public, hoping my growing influence might shield them. I let them. I smiled, I accepted their shallow praise, and I remembered every insult, every sneer, every cruel word. I would use their desperation later. Marcus turned to me at last, his fury cracked into desperation. He begged for my loyalty, promised he would change, swore he still loved me. He tried to take my hands, his eyes searching for the meek bride he believed I still was. I pulled my hands away, my smile sharp as glass. I told him that once I had loved him enough to endure humiliation, betrayal, and pain, but that woman had died. The bride he had broken was gone, and in her place stood the wife he would regret losing for the rest of his life. His face crumbled, and for the first time I saw him truly afraid, not of society, not of his debts, but of me. Adrian stood at my side that night, his presence a steady flame while Marcus collapsed into ruin. He did not speak of love, not yet, but his eyes told me enough. He knew I was not a woman to be won like a prize. I was a woman who chose, and my choice would never be Marcus again. My revenge was nearly complete, but I savored the knowledge that Marcus was living the fate I had once suffered, cast out, mocked, abandoned. He had thought himself untouchable. Now he was nothing but a man drowning in the regret of losing the one woman who could have saved him. And this time I would never reach out my hand. The ruin came in waves, each one heavier than the last. Marcus could not step into a room without whispers following him, could not speak without someone questioning his honesty, could not even walk beside me without people wondering how I endured him for so long. He tried to salvage what remained, begged for loans, promised returns he could never deliver, but the doors that once opened at his command were now slammed in his face. Even Clara and Vivian stopped defending him, their eyes turning toward me whenever society gathered. They smiled at me sweetly now, called me the pride of the family, clung to my reputation to shield their own. I let them, knowing the humiliation of dependence was punishment enough. Marcus watched as his own blood leaned on the wife he had scorned, and I saw the regret hollow him out. He came to me one evening, his arrogance shattered, his voice trembling. He fell to his knees, clutching at my gown, swearing he had been blind, swearing he still loved me, swearing he would change if I gave him one chance. In my first life, those words would have broken me, would have made me believe redemption was possible. Now they made me laugh. The sound was soft, cold, merciless. I told him that he had never loved me, that what he mourned was not me but the power I had become, the throne I had taken from him. I reminded him that he had mocked me, humiliated me, cast me aside without hesitation. And then I told him the truth that sliced deeper than any blade, that I had loved him once, but that love had rotted the day he betrayed me. There was nothing left for him to win back. He had lost me forever, and the weight of that loss was his punishment. He sobbed at my feet, the proud man who had once paraded his mistress and laughed at my tears. I stepped back, watching him collapse into despair, watching him realize that no matter how much he begged, no matter how deeply he regretted, there was no path back to me. He would live the rest of his life knowing he had thrown away the only woman who could have stood at his side as an equal, and that knowledge would devour him far longer than ruin ever could. Adrian entered then, his presence steady, his gaze fixed on me rather than Marcus. He did not need to speak to make his stance clear. He stood as the man Marcus could never be: loyal, strong, respectful. Whispers in society already tied our names together, and I did nothing to stop them. Marcus saw the way Adrian's eyes lingered on me, saw the way I allowed it, and in that moment his regret deepened into despair. He realized he had not only lost me but that someone far worthier had seen my value all along. The next day society was alive with the story of Marcus's downfall, and at its center was me, not as a victim but as the woman who endured, who rose above, who became untouchable. Marcus avoided the gatherings now, too broken to face the scorn, too consumed by the regret that clung to him like a shroud. I attended them all, hand in hand with Adrian when I wished, alone when I chose, and each time I walked into a room the whispers followed me, not of pity but of reverence. I had become what Marcus could never make me, the queen of a stage that bowed to no one. And the beauty of it was simple. Marcus would live long enough to see me shine brighter every day, long enough to remember that I had once been his, long enough to drown in the knowledge that he could never have me again. Marcus became a shadow of the man he once was. The same people who had once rushed to shake his hand now turned their backs when he entered a room. Businessmen who once hung on his every word dismissed him with cold smiles. Even Clara and Vivian, desperate to protect their own standing, stopped speaking his name aloud. He wandered through society halls like a ghost, his eyes hollow, his voice stripped of power. And every time his gaze fell on me, the regret in his expression deepened. He remembered the wife who once sat silently by his side, enduring humiliation, and he saw the woman I had become, the woman he had lost forever. That was his true punishment. Not ruin, not debt, not disgrace. It was knowing I had risen higher than he could ever reach, knowing that I was untouchable. I stepped into those same halls with my head high, no longer Marcus's ornament but the center of every circle. My laughter carried farther, my words were repeated like scripture, my presence turned gatherings into stages where I reigned. They called me the queen of society, the woman who endured betrayal and emerged stronger. I let them speak. I let them praise. I let them build me into the throne I had always deserved. Adrian often stood at my side, calm and steady, a man who never tried to overshadow me. His quiet strength was a contrast to Marcus's arrogance, and whispers tied our names together with approval rather than scandal. When he offered me his arm, I took it not because I needed him but because I chose to. That was the difference. I was no longer the wife who sacrificed herself to elevate a man. I was the woman who had built her own crown, who could choose companionship without surrendering power. The final time Marcus tried to speak to me, his voice was hoarse, his hands shaking. He whispered that he still loved me, that he could not live without me. I looked at him with cold clarity and told him the truth, that love without respect is nothing, and that he had killed whatever bond we once had. He had thought me powerless, but he had made me stronger. He had thought me replaceable, but he had made me irreplaceable. He had thought I would always be his, but I was never his to begin with. His face crumbled, his lips parted as if to beg again, but no words came. I turned from him, my gown sweeping the floor like a banner, and I did not look back. That night I stood at the top of a staircase overlooking a ballroom lit by golden chandeliers, Adrian's hand steady on mine, society gazing up at me with admiration. In another life I had been the silent wife who died in disgrace. In this one I was reborn as the woman Marcus regretted losing, the woman who wore her scars as a crown, the woman who would never be won back. And as the music swelled and the room bowed to my presence, I knew the truth that would haunt him until his last breath. I was not his wife anymore. I was his regret. Forever.